Welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Grimes, the CEO of Born Free USA, and thank you all for joining us today for this discussion of conservation and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing right now, and for the bold solutions needed to restore our Earth. We have an amazing panel. First up, we have Elise Stroud, Born Free USA's Africa Policy and Capacity Building Director. She will briefly discuss the conservation crisis and policy opportunities. We also have some videos from our partners in Ghana and Liberia to give their thoughts on the priority needs of their countries and the region. We have a message from an economist, Ralph Shami, Assistant Director at the International Monetary Fund, who will highlight some key economic figures and potential impact. And then we will spend the majority of our time in a roundtable discussion with Elise, Ian Redmond, and John Scanlon. Ian is the co-founder of Rebalance Earth and policy advocate for Born Free Foundation. And John Scanlon is the CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative, chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and former Secretary General of CITES. Unfortunately, Will Travers is unable to join us today. While everyone is gathering, I'd like to invite you to use the chat. Give us your comments, pose any questions. We will follow up by email with your questions in the next few days. The time for this event, we don't have a Q&A session at the end, but we'll get back to you shortly. I'd also like to invite you to visit bornfreeusa.org to learn more about this topic and our programs and all of the work that Born Free USA is doing to protect animals, promote welfare, and rebalance the planet and the earth that we all have to care for. I'd like to also ask you to support this work by making a donation on our website at bornfreeusa.org or by texting Born Free, that's BORNFREE, to the number 44321. We're going to put this in the chat, so you'll have that handy. And now I'd like to just jump right into the topic and welcome Elise Stroud to the screen. Elise is a French lawyer. She specializes in international environmental and natural resources law. Her focus at Born Free USA is on international policy and developing the ability of African governments to fight wildlife crime and build consensus between countries to share resources and implement international agreements. Thank you, Elise, and I will turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you, Angela, and welcome everyone. We're very pleased to be able to organize this very important webinar where we get to talk about the work that we want to undertake. We're undertaking every day to restore our Earth. So the very, very brief introduction that I will make before this important discussion is to give a little perspective on the biodiversity crisis that we are facing, because we all need to understand the threats that we are confronted to in order to understand how to build an effective response. The findings of the scientific community are very dire. In 2019, there was a world assessment that was led, and scientists told us that we are facing a mass extinction event, with up to 1 million species at risk of extinction, many within decades. Nature is declining globally. Findings show that 75% of the terrestrial environment is severely altered, which means that it can no longer provide the ecosystem services that it's meant to provide appropriately. We've lost more than 85% of the surface of wetlands altogether, and deforestation has reached very unprecedented levels. In 2019 alone, in the tropics, we lost 11.9 million hectares of tree cover in 2019, which corresponds to losing a football field of primary forest every 6 seconds for a full year. This is completely devastating, and it's affecting our ability to mitigate climate change. Temperatures are rising, and we're no longer able to cope. Today, the world's oceans are warmer, more acidic, more polluted, and losing more oxygen than ever before. And it's causing unprecedented damage to all marine life. On the top of that, we're continuing our exploitation of marine species unabated. If you look at statistics on fisheries, FAO estimates that today 31.4% of fish stocks are either fished to capacity or overfished. If we continue that road, climate change will continue intensifying biodiversity loss. Projections indicate that by 2100, which is only 80 years from now, climate change could result in the loss of more than half of African bird and mammal species. More than half of African bird and mammal species completely gone in 80 years if we don't change. We will see a 20 to 30% decline in the productivity of Africa's lake and significant loss in African plant species. So it is high time to change and to be bold for nature. Next slide, please, Karen. I wanted to show you through this slide that the mass extinction event we're encountering affects all species groups. Next slide. If we don't change, we simply won't be able to sustain life on Earth. We will continue to lose the ecosystem goods and services on which life depends. Clean water, clean air will be jeopardized. We will lose the pollinators that ensure that our crops are sustainable. We will continue to be increasingly exposed to zoonotic pandemics like COVID-19 due to increased contact between human and wildlife. And we will increasingly be exposed to climate instability with floods, droughts, and cataclysmic events. This will continue to impact livelihood, folk security. It is high time to have bold reforms for nature. Next slide, Karen, please. We wanted to give you a little bit of perspective on field challenges to nature conservation. This is important to show you that conservation is very, very challenging and made difficult by this crisis and this thirst for the exploitation of nature. So we will project a video here that will give you the voice of some of our partners. You will hear Ali Mahama, the park manager of Mole National Park, which is the biggest wildlife refuge in Ghana. You will hear from James Opong, who is the CITES Management Authority of Ghana and is a key player in combating wildlife crime in Ghana. You will hear in Liberia from Attorney Dolo, who works for the Liberia Forestry Development Authority, and from Jenny Desmond, who is the founder of the Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection. And I think their voice needs to be heard to make this devastation concrete and these challenges very concrete. So Karen, please, if we can play the video.
Mole National Park is Ghana's premier park. It is the largest park in the country. Mole is 4,577 square kilometers. Mole has a very strong law enforcement unit. However, there are several challenges that bedevil the law enforcement unit. Critical among these challenges are vehicular or transportation issues. The park law enforcement has just only one vehicle for all its operational activities. We need more than one vehicle for operations. The park equally has issues of communication. Only 5% of the park has national coverage, communication coverage. And so we need some communication system. A control room needs to be set up. Communication needs to be enhanced so that staff making arrests in any part of the park can easily communicate it to the park headquarters or to the nearest outpost camp so that they can rush in and then pick up or give support to the staff. The other challenge includes accommodation. The staff have four main ranges where they stay. However, we need satellite camps to back up with the main range camps that we have. So apart from this, we also need some other camps within the satellite camps inside the park, so that normally when staff travel like 40-50 kilometers off their main outpost area, they can get a place to stay and then work, search, combat any illegal activity within their area. Food ration is another critical issue. The staff in the park go out to buy or purchase food for their operations, for their field operations, which is not the best. It gives out a lot of information to poachers, to suspected crime offenders about the staff. So we need to be able to procure purchase food stuff for, staff who normally go on operations or law enforcement patrols. Apart from this, some of these communities are quite hostile to our staff, and so we need to see how we can work on the hostility. Because once a butcher is arrested from a particular community, staff normally who visit there for any other activity are being attacked. We have 33 communities around Mole National Park. These people are normally very poor, and because they don't have any form of education, and so the high levels of poverty, they are the main challenge of the park. They go to the park to coach. So we need more funding to help us do a lot of community sensitization, go into the basic schools to educate the young ones. Because once we educate them young, when they grow up, they will know the essence of conservation. Apart from that, we also need to support the communities with a lot of livelihood activities. Livelihood activities such as sending beekeeping to the communities, the beekeeping intervention, helping the people to train them on craft shop, and several other training programs like helping them develop the community resource management areas where ecotourism could be a potential area that can send a lot of livelihood or send a lot of money into the pockets of the local people.
Law enforcement challenges a key issue concerning the wildlife um, division. Law enforcement, as elaborated by the manager of Mole National Park, is not peculiar to Mole National Park, but also to all the other protected areas. As a matter of priority, regular training for law enforcement staff is key. Also, community conservation education as well as the provision of alternative livelihood is also very necessary, as well as providing training for stakeholders like judges and prosecutors, custom officers, police, and other stakeholders that assist us in enforcing um, wildlife laws within the country, as well as combating international wildlife crime.
So I'm Anthony Yankweze Dolo. I work for the Forestry Development Authority. Liberia is a very green country with vast resources of flora and fauna. Uh, but there have been some difficulty as it relates to how we protect our fauna. And we have started to take action. Uh, Ensuring the enforcement of the various laws and regulations now. We are strengthening things through a multi-stakeholder approach. All of the players are now involved with the Ministry of Justice, local NGOs. They have all been supporting our program. We are now sending our deterrents, are now arresting people who are violating the wildlife law and processing them through court. I think this is important as sending the message to the local population that the law must be respected. And besides that, these animals, considering how green we are, is our own natural heritage. How we protect them will determine to a large extent how our country can harness our own natural capital.
Hi, I'm Jenny Desmond. I am the founder of Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection in West Africa. And LCRP works very hard to rescue chimpanzees in need and most hard to keep wild chimps wild. This is my little baby, Mary Beauty here. She unfortunately is an orphan because of the bushmeat and pet trades. And in the wild, Mary Beauty and every other baby like her would be receiving 24-hour care from their mothers. They would be attached to mom. They would be with mom 100% of the time. Unfortunately, when we get them, they've lost their moms and they're orphans. And so we try to replicate the care they would be getting in the wild and provide them with human surrogate mothers. It's not ideal, but we're doing the best we can to give them the life that we hope will be a happy and joyful one. The bigger problem, of course, is that these guys keep coming, and protected wildlife in Liberia is under siege. Not just chimpanzees, but all wildlife. Western chimpanzees are critically endangered. They have lost their populations by 80% in the last 25 years. And so this is a very, very serious issue. With partners like Born Free USA and others, we have worked very hard to raise awareness, to work with communities, to strengthen law enforcement and build capacity and training. But we have so much more to do. So let's keep the momentum going. Let's keep it up. Let's fight wildlife crime and stop it in its tracks.
So I think this is a very powerful message that clearly shows that we must do more for nature. And we must address the biodiversity crisis if we hope to sustain human life. If we look at the world today, we are completely failing at what we must do. We know for a fact that protected areas are recognized as the cornerstone of biodiversity conservation. And yet today, only 15% of the world's landmass and 7% of the world's ocean are protected. We know that direct exploitation of wild animals and plants, which includes commercial trade, is recognized as the second biggest driver of biodiversity loss, first driver for marine species. And yet we continue. Our legal framework is too weak to even prohibit the commercial trade of the species that are endangered, critically endangered, and it continues bringing the species to the brink of extinction. We must urgently change the scale of our response, and we must rethink our relationship with nature to prioritize recovery. And this is what the Global Nature Recovery Investment Initiative calls for. We call on international bodies, national government to prioritize financial investment in nature recovery and protection for a change of scale in response. Next slide, please. The priority of the Global Nature Recovery Investment Initiative is to make sure that nature is heard, valued, recognized, prioritized, and loved as it should be. We need to amplify through this initiative the knowledge and the science that lays out how we need to change to ensure that nature can recover. We aim through this initiative to give nature a voice and to ensure that the priorities of our natural world are what drives economic growth and what drives the decisions that the leaders will take to tackle the recovery from COVID-19. Our focus through this initiative is to halt biodiversity loss and wildlife overexploitation, to enhance the viability of ecosystem services, to expand protected areas and mitigate climate change, to promote public health and animal health, sustainable livelihoods, food security, to reform and realign the way in which nature is financed. Next slide, please. Before COVID-19 struck, world leaders and climate activists said that 2020 was going to be a super year for nature. There will be multiple negotiations scheduled. With the pandemic, all of these negotiations have been postponed. And so we're looking at a series of landmark meetings, which together will set the agenda on climate change and nature for the decades to come. At Born Free, we want 2021 to be an exceptional year. We want this to be a year of ambition and opportunity to drive better outcomes for climate change, nature, and people. I'm not going to be able to lay out all of our priorities for all of the meetings that you see on your screen today. The purpose of our event today is to highlight two priority initiatives which were launched in response to the biodiversity crisis that we're facing, which were the End Wildlife Crime Initiative and Rebalance Earth. And you will hear more about this in a little while. Right now, I'm very, very honored to be able to present a video by Rolf Shami, who currently works as the Assistant Director in the Institute for Capacity Development of the International Monetary Fund. Rolf has a PhD in economics from the Johns Hopkins University and has worked for the IMF for the last 22 years. He's co-founder of Rebalance Earth and he will present the urgent need to change the paradigm of species conservation by showcasing the importance of the services provided by the natural world and the need to translate what science is telling us about the value of nature into the language of the markets and policymakers. So I will let Ralph speak now. Thank you, Karen.
The current economic and financial paradigm divorces humans from their natural world and assumes that nature is limitless and free. These unfounded presumptions have led to an extractive view of nature, where trees are cut down and sold for their timber, whales are killed and sold for their meat, elephants killed and sold for their tusks, salt marshes, seagrass, mangroves destroyed to make way for commercial and residential developments. Not to mention polluting with impunity the air, land, and water with plastics, waste, and sound. This behavior has led to the climate crisis that is upon us, and to the destruction of our natural world and its biodiversity. Yet it is self-evident that our well-being and that the sustainability of our own economic system are very much dependent on the sustainability of our ecosystem and biodiversity. Healthy forests, we all know, help capture carbon dioxide, but science now tells us that also live whales and live elephants help sequester huge amounts of carbon dioxide, and so do mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes, phytoplankton, and the list goes on and on. There is a clear link between a healthy natural world and the fight against climate change. So how is it then that a living nature that is so crucial to our existence has a price of zero? Price, after all, should be derived from value and not the other way around. For example, ecosystem services of a live great whale are worth over $2 million per whale. A live forest elephant, its carbon sequestration services alone are worth $1.75 million per elephant. A healthy salt marsh in terms of carbon sequestration and flood control alone is worth over $140,000 per hectare. Yet the current market price of each of those is zero. It's zero for the ecosystem services of a living whale. It is zero for the carbon sequestration services of a living elephant or salt marsh, seagrass, mangroves, and the list goes on and on. Worse, a dead whale fetches $40,000 in countries where whale meat is still eaten. Ivory of a single dead elephant fetches close to $40,000. So things are valued when they're dead. This represents a serious fallacy. We need a new economic paradigm that properly integrates the ecosystem services of the natural world and correctly prices the value of its services. Given the science and the correct valuation of the services of these natural assets, we can then codify them as natural capital into law. Then we can begin to create markets around the protection and regeneration of a living natural world. Local communities can then benefit by finding meaningful employment and income. Businesses would develop services around a living nature. Private capital seeking blue-green investments would pour in, and governments would benefit from public-private partnerships and the expansion of the tax base. And the world would benefit from a healthy nature and a cleaner environment. This is the win-win paradigm. This is the framework that will bring sustained and inclusive economic prosperity and well-being for all creatures, big and small. Nature is the house in which we live. Nature is not an externality. Just like we take care of our homes by investing in maintaining and improving them, so we need to invest in nature, and conservation is the way to do so. Nature has been looking after us since time immemorial. It is time for us to give back to the only home we have ever known, to use a phrase from Carl Sagan's famous pale blue dot, and most likely the only home we will ever know. It's time for us to stand up for nature so it can continue to stand up for all of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful video, Ralph. Clearly, there is much work to be done, and we've outlined very briefly some of the problems and the needs that we have here in the world. But we also want to talk about innovative solutions and bold solutions. So Elise, I'd like to bring you back on, and I'm delighted to welcome John Scanlon and Ian Redmond to this discussion. John Scanlon is the Chief Executive Officer of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation. He previously served as Secretary General of CITES from 2010 to 2018. And during that time, he led the establishment of the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. John is the chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime and chair of the UK Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. In 2019, he was awarded the prestigious Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to wildlife conservation and protection. And Ian is co-founder of Rebalance Earth and policy advocate for Born Free Foundation. He's also a tropical field biologist and conservationist. He is renowned for his work with great apes and elephants, and Ian is ambassador for the UN's Convention on Migratory Species and chairman of the Ape Alliance and the Gorilla Organization. He has no free time, I could say. Ian also has the distinct award of Order of the British Empire. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is going to be a roundtable discussion, so please, I'm going to kick us off with a question, but anyone please just jump in with your response. So John, I'd like to start with you. You're the chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. Can you tell us about this and why it is a vital part of our response to the conservation crisis?
Great, thanks, Angela. Greetings all. Wonderful start to today's session. Great videos. In particular, that one by Ralph was quite compelling about how we value nature. Alice has set the scene there very well about the crises we're confronting with biodiversity loss, with climate change, with the risk of future wildlife-related pandemics. And our legal framework is not equipped to deal with it. In particular, as we deal with wildlife trade, be it legal, illegal, or unregulated. And I think what this COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that there are some serious gaps in our legal framework. And if we're going to avoid future wildlife-related pandemics, if we're going to end wildlife crime and all the implications it has for biodiversity loss, climate change, and pandemics, we're going to have to change the system. Now, this global initiative to end wildlife crime, which we kicked off in June last year, it's a gathering of a very diverse group of people and organizations that have many different views on many different things, but we all converge on the fact that we need to make some fundamental changes to our international legal framework. There are serious gaps there that need to be filled. And we are promoting two changes to the international legal framework. Firstly, on wildlife trade, and this is legal and unregulated trade. At the moment, we rely upon CITES, that's the principal instrument, but CITES only looks at wildlife trade from a biodiversity conservation perspective. It looks at the implications of that trade on the survival of species at its source. It doesn't take any account of the public health or animal health implications of that trade, from capture through transit through destination. Now that has many implications, but in particular, it exposes us to the risk of future pandemics, wildlife-related pandemics. And what we're saying is you have to take a One Health approach to wildlife trade. So continue to look at the biodiversity conservation implications, but also look at the implications for human health and animal health, not just at source, but through transit right through to destination, including at markets. So that's what we're saying. We need to change the legal framework there, take a One Health approach. On the other side, on wildlife crime, these crimes are estimated to have an impact of somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion a year. That's trillion dollars, not billion. $1 to $2 trillion a year is the impact of wildlife crime, according to the World Bank. When you look at the implications of the value of the contraband, but more importantly, loss of government revenue and the impact on ecosystems and their services. It has an impact on the ability to mitigate climate, to produce fresh water, fresh soils. Really damaging crimes, but we don't have any global agreement on how we prevent and combat wildlife crime. To date, we've relied very heavily on CITES in the absence of any other instrument, But CITES is a trade-related instrument that obliges you to penalize breaches of that convention, but not to criminalize it. And CITES only deals with 38,000 of the world's 8 million species. And it deals with very small number of tree species, which are illegally traded for timber, and fish species. So what we're saying is we need to lift this out of a trade regime and put it in a crime regime. And we need a new global agreement on wildlife crime that deals with all species that are found in illegal trade or being illicitly trafficked, whether they're protected under CITES or not. And we're saying you can do that by creating a new protocol. It's a sub-agreement under the existing UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which already has protocols on human trafficking, migrant smuggling, and firearms. So we're saying, let's take these crimes as seriously as they should be, embedded in the international criminal law framework, and start addressing these crimes the way we have to. So that's what the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime was set up to promote. Born Free was a founding partner as part of our steering group, along with a number of others. And we're actively promoting this. We've drafted what a protocol could look like. We've drafted what changes to wildlife trade laws could look like. And we're busy promoting that in particular to states, but to the broader community as well.
Thank you, John. That was great. Elise, I know you've had some experience, quite a bit of experience with CITES enforcement, and whether animals are protected under the CITES agreement or not, enforcement is an issue. And being able to investigate, prosecute, and deal with this criminal activity. Do you want to speak a bit about that side of things, and perhaps some of the work that Born Free is doing in the West African region?
Yes, no, exactly. So we have been leading some wildlife crime threat assessment across ECOWAS countries. So in 13 West African countries, where we've led some experts to support authorities to lead an assessment of priorities on what to do to tackle wildlife crime appropriately. And we have in particular looked at the legal frameworks at the national level and the sub-regional level. And what transpires is that legislations at the national level do not recognize in West Africa wildlife crime as a serious crime. So the initiative that is proposed by End Wildlife Crime is of vital importance, because it will help national enforcement efforts by contributing to the recognition that wildlife crime is indeed a serious crime and should be prosecuted as one, with the penalties that are associated with it, and with the disincentive to continue perpetrating wildlife crime. So it is a very, very key initiative. It's an initiative that's much needed, and that is desired by a lot of West African countries in particular, who are really making huge progress at their own level in coordinating to combat wildlife crime, where we've seen a lot of discussions around the development of a West Africa strategy on combating wildlife crime, which calls on the recognition of wildlife crime as a serious crime. So this initiative is much needed in the field and will have a very practical impact.
Great. Thank you. Ian, is there anything you'd like to jump in on right now?
Many things that I'd like to have jumped in on in various places, but no, thank you. First of all, I want to wish you and everyone who's watching a happy Earth Day. It's Earth Day today, and on Earth Day we celebrate our planet. But the bit of the planet that we're most familiar with is a thin film of gas and water vapor mostly, that encircles the ball of rock. When people say, well, we've got to work hard and save the world, they're not talking about the ball of rock. They're talking about the biosphere. And a Canadian educator once pointed out to me that if you reduce the Earth to the size of a beach ball and ask people, where do you think the atmosphere stops? That they're thinking, this far out. Whereas in fact, it's the thickness of cling film, of wrapping film, very thin layer that is the biosphere. That's where we live. So it stands to reason that if that's where we live, we want to ensure that it's able to. And here, I think, lies one of the big problems, because this is the Born Free Foundation. Most of the people watching this will think animals are beautiful. And of course, I think animals are beautiful too. Mm-hmm. But they're not just ornaments. And most of the value that we do ascribe to animals is based on how much we like them. And that's understandable. I've got a forest elephant behind, at least an image of a forest elephant behind me, and he is magnificent. and I got to meet him because he visits the park headquarters of Nuabali Ndoki National Park in Congo. And it's a very gentle elephant, and it's called a Gentil. And Gentil, the elephant, might occasionally be photographed by one of the few visitors ever to get there. But as far as the economy is concerned, that's his only potential value, unless you shoot him and take those fine front teeth and carve something nice out of them and sell them to someone who values such artistry. As Ralph was saying, as long as Gentil is alive, he's worth zero. I'm very surprised to be able to say this next sentence, but I'm working with Ralph. I'm working with the Assistant Director of the International Monetary Fund and a London-based insurance and blockchain expert called Walid Al-Sakaf on Rebalance Earth. And again, the Earth we're talking about is not the ball of rock, it's human relationship with the biosphere. And we're doing that because a French biologist called Fabio Bazzaghi looked at two patches of forest in the Congo Basin, one where there was a population of elephants like Gentil, and one where the elephants were extirpated decades ago. And what he found was that the above ground carbon, basically the branches and trees of the larger branches and trunks of the larger trees, was about 7% higher where there were elephants. So you lose the elephants and your forest is likely to lose 7% of its ability to store carbon. And in the past, that might have been an interesting academic observation, but today we're very focused on carbon. There are carbon markets around the world. So it turns out that elephants, as well as being magnificent and nice to take pictures of and nice to make little models of to entertain our children, they're doing a really important job. I have been banging on for years, as some of you may know, about elephants and apes being the gardeners of the forest. And I talk about seed dispersal and nutrient recycling, but what I hadn't quite realized was the extent to which their weeding of the garden is important. That's important because imagine if you're growing vegetables and wildflower seeds blow into your vegetable patch, you take out those plants because you don't want them to compete with your vegetables for the nutrients. You want big vegetables and none of what we call weeds. I don't like the word weeds, but anyway, let's use that word because everyone understands. You weed your garden and you put the dead weeds onto a compost heap, and when they've mulched down nicely, you'll put that compost full of nutrients back on your vegetable patch. When an elephant is walking around in a forest, it's trampling on small plants, it's eating everything it can reach with its trunk, and the compost bin is its stomach. All that vegetation churning around in there, yes, it will digest out some of the nutrients, but an awful lot come out the other end in the dung. Now, an average elephant like Gentil produces more than 1 metric ton of dung every week, 52 weeks a year. So you've got 100 elephants, 100 tons of dung per week. That's a lot of nutrient-rich fertilizer to enrich the soils of the forest. And the trees that are standing, what Fabio calls the late succession trees, are taking up these nutrients, and they're facing less competition from the smaller plants that the elephant has either eaten or trampled on. So they are effectively doing the weeding. And that means not big vegetables, but big trees do well. And that 7% difference, if you do lots of calculations that I'm not capable of doing, but Ralph Sharmi is a former professor of economics with colleagues who are still professors of economics have done, suggests that that service that every elephant in the forests of Africa is providing to the world can be valued at $1.75 million. And that was at the price of carbon 2 years ago. That price has gone up, so it's probably about 2.75 million now, and it will continue to rise as long as companies and individuals and governments want to offset their carbon emissions. We all understand that we have to change the technology and stop emitting greenhouse gases, but that will take years, in some cases decades. And until we can stop emitting, we have to offset, that is, ensure that that amount that we're putting out is taken in somewhere else. And there isn't enough land to plant more trees. We have to make the land that we've got sequestering and storing carbon more efficient. And the best way to do that, it turns out, is to protect the elephants and the gorillas and the chimpanzees and the orangutans and the tapirs and all the species that are involved in that ecosystem. So what we have with Rebalance Earth is a mechanism for valuing the ecosystem services, not just of the whole ecosystem, which is a sort of nebulous concept for most people, but of individual animals at a rate which will bring more money into that region than tourism or extracting ivory or timber could. So more money so that the people who live there can improve their quality of life, have schools and clinics within easy reach, not long distances away. And on the boards that usually say, provided as a gift from the people of the United States of America through USAID, or provided through the European Economic Community, all that, instead it will say, provided by your elephants. So people will start to see elephants not just as a nuisance because they raid the crops, not just as a potential tourist photo, but if there aren't any tourists, they're worthless. No, as a part of the Earth's ecosystem, which sustains us all. And now at last, we're beginning to actually value properly. That's why I'm really excited by Rebalance Earth, and forgive me for going on so long about it.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's so important. I mean, people who are here listening to a Born Free webinar clearly care about animals. And we all want to protect the species and the individuals. John, you mentioned earlier the One Health platform. And, you know, and saving the animals, protecting their habitats is vital and important, but we also have to look at the people. We have to look beyond just the animals, and I know the One Health platform incorporates that. Would you like to speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that Alice and Ian have touched upon something important here, and that is that we traditionally have looked at things in a very siloed way. So you look at wildlife, then you look at biodiversity more generally, you look at climate change, you look at development, you look at public health, and we separate it all. And that's what we humans tend to do because it's easier for us to grasp if we just do a little slice at a time. What we're seeing, in particular through this COVID-19 pandemic and also through climate change, is that all these issues are interconnected. And that we've got to stop looking at wildlife just from the perspective of wildlife conservation, which is critically important. But wildlife conservation is also about protecting biodiversity, ecosystems, combating climate change, adapting to climate change, preventing pandemics, providing regional security, providing jobs for people in remote locations. That is actually what wildlife conservation does. And we've got to see a convergence of these agendas. Now, when we get a recognition of that, and I think the penny is starting to drop primarily through COVID-19 and its interrelationship with wildlife, but also through climate change, the penny's dropping that we're going to have to start getting investment into wildlife conservation from other sectors. We can't just draw on small wildlife budgets and think that we're going to protect the biodiversity of the planet. No, this is about biodiversity, it's about climate change. And Ian's given a great example of connecting elephants to one of the biggest challenges we're confronting on the planet. And elephants are there working 24/7 for combating climate change, but it's just not recognized. It's not being recognized in the financial system. The same with pandemics. By better regulating wildlife trade, by better dealing with illegal wildlife trade, and by better protecting wild places, we're going to prevent future pandemics. The IPBES, the UN IPBES says there's 1.7 million viruses that are thought to be, that are undiscovered, thought to exist in wild animals, of which about half could spill over to people. Now, if we're going to keep acting the way we are, we're going to confront more pandemics, worse pandemics, impacts of climate change, loss of biodiversity. So the One Health approach is one aspect of this, and it's saying that you can't just look at public health separate from animal health, separate from environmental health. They're all interrelated. So you have to look at them together. What are the implications of having, what's the approach we have to take to have healthy people, healthy animals, and a healthy environment? That's the One Health approach. At the moment, we're too siloed. We have to bring it all together for many good reasons, including attracting the investment that we need in wildlife conservation from sectors that traditionally haven't invested. Health, climate, although they've talked about it a long time, it's starting to come now, and security and development. These budgets need to be directed towards wildlife conservation because the benefits are many.
And I know we and other organizations have approached, the G20 to talk about these sorts of, and promote that kind of funding on a large international scale, and really rethinking how conservation funding should work and to the level that it should. Would somebody like to maybe talk a little more about that?
If I can jump in there, yes. It's as someone who's been involved in conservation for 40 something years, and I've done the sponsored walks, I've run the marathon, I've climbed mountains to try and raise bits of money. And the people who donate to the people who do walks or jump out of airplanes or do things to raise money are donating a little bit of their disposable income. So at the end of the month, when you've paid the bills and you've bought the new shoes for your kids and you've paid whatever else you have to pay out of, if you've got any money left, you might give some to charity. And you might give some to charities that help homeless children or people with other issues. And some of it might go to animal charities, and some of it might go to domestic animals, companion animals, farm animals, and some of it might go to wildlife. So you're talking about a bit that helps organizations like Born Free. And I'm impressed by how much Born Free and other such charities do. And I applaud everyone who gives a little bit of their hard-earned money to charity. But that's never going to be enough to combat the kind of extractive industries that might think, well, let's put $1 billion into looking for a valuable ore in this part of the world. And we know that if we spend $1 billion and we find that ore, we'll get back many, many billions of dollars. And yet we're trying to raise 10,000 for a project here or 20,000 for a project there by asking people to give a little bit of their disposable income. So we say, well, what about governments? They've got money. Of course, it's all taxpayers' money. And every government on the planet has to, first of all, prioritize education and health and transport and defense and industry and all the other human stuff. And if there's a little bit left over, then we'll give it to the nature, because in the perception of most politicians, nature is ornamental. You look at how architects plan cities and they've got a little tree here and a little tree there. They're not thinking of the function of the tree. They're thinking of how nice it looks. So at the Paris climate talks, I was on a panel in a side event just after the middle weekend where they drafted the agreement. And a journalist who had done more homework than me stood up and said, the word biodiversity doesn't appear once in the climate agreement. What? And I said, well, I don't think these negotiations should be allowed in the room if they haven't got some training in ecology. I don't think elected representatives should be allowed to take decisions about ecosystems if they haven't got some understanding of ecology. But we are where we are. And instead of bearded biologists banging on about this for years, now we have the assistant director and indeed the managing director of the International Monetary Fund recognizing the value of nature, saying we have to include natural capital. So if we are successful with Rebalance Earth, when any of you who are watching or any of us go out and buy an item, a camera or a computer or a car, whatever we need to buy, a portion of that purchase price will have gone into carbon offsetting. And with the Rebalance Earth idea, that carbon offsetting will actually be protecting elephants, which are keystone species in a very biodiverse habitat. So you're preventing biodiversity loss, you're supporting nature-based solutions to climate change, sequestering 7% more carbon in those forests. And we're doing that through a blockchain mechanism, which means instead of the current carbon markets, which are full of middlemen getting their 10%, and by the time you get to the ground, there's not much left of the original amount of money. Here we cut out the middlemen and go straight to the elephant. And the people who live around the elephant, who will then have the money to protect it, the money to put up a fence if they want to keep the elephant out of their crops, the money to build a clinic or a school if they want their community to have a better quality of life and educate their kids better and have better health. So it's using the purchasing power of the public through the things that they want to buy, a proportion of which goes back to help solve all these global issues. Many of the Sustainable Development Goals, it used to be the Millennium Development Goals, I've got to keep up. The Sustainable Development Goals are going to be helped by this concept of bringing the price of conservation into the economy. So it's no longer an externality that just gets the crumbs when everything else has been covered. It's actually built into the economy. And that, I think, should be our big goal so that payment for ecosystem services doesn't depend on overstretched taxpayers' money or little bits of charitable money, but part of the overall economy. So that's what we're hoping to do, change the world's economy. Not a big task.
So for the average person who isn't able to change the world economy, what can the public do to change the momentum that we have and to be a part of the necessary change?
3 P's. Your power of your pocket. When you do buy something, make sure that the paper is FSC or otherwise certified, the wooden products come from well-managed forests. You have purchasing power, and companies listen to you. So if you're not buying a company's product, tell them that you're not buying it because you don't like the fact that they haven't been careful in sourcing their ingredient. So that's the power of your pocket. The power of your political power. You're either a voter, or if you're too young to vote, you soon will be a voter, and your parents vote, and elected representatives listen to you. Tell them what you think. They're paid to represent you. If you don't tell them what you think, how can they represent your views? And the third power, P, is your personal power, because we're all people with time and skills, and organizations like Born Free depend on people who volunteer, either to raise funds or to spread the word, educate people. So the 3 P's of power of your pocket, your political power, and your personal power. You can do a lot.
And Angela, if I may jump in really quick, another thing to keep in mind is that there are some very concrete objectives that need to be reached at the upcoming negotiations that are going to be led, be it for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, the climate change negotiations. And so Born Free will be laying out some of these objectives in a format that allows the public to talk to their decision makers and make their voice clear about the urgent need to prioritize nature recovery in these settings, to prioritize the fight against wildlife crime as well. And so we will be providing some guidance and some concrete actions that the public can take as well on the policy front to try to make sure that the message to decision makers is clear and coming from the public.
Great. So we've got a few more minutes remaining. I would like to just open up to, rather than asking a specific question, just open up if there's anything that you would like to add, possibly about some of the other nature-based solutions, or to expand on anything that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think we are starting to see a convergence, and I think the point Alice has made is important, and what Ian's been saying is important. We have, as I said before, been too siloed, and Ian gave the example of Paris Agreement and negotiators not talking about biodiversity. There's been lip service given to the interaction between biodiversity and climate and development and security and now public health, but we haven't institutionalized it, and we haven't seen it get traction, in particular the way financing is flowing. I do think, though, that we've turned a corner, and I do think that it's this COVID-19 pandemic that has caused people to take pause, and I do think the penny has dropped, that the way in which we're interacting with nature can't be sustained. It has to stop, and for many reasons, the biodiversity, the climate, and this issue of future pandemics. And we are starting to see a convergence between the three, and we are starting to see biodiversity and climate finally start coming together with a true recognition of nature-based solutions, which can provide up to a third of the mitigation of emissions between now and 2030. And we're importantly starting to see funding from major financing institutions flow into nature-based solutions. So I do think we've got to a point where we're starting to see a shift, but we have to maintain that momentum, and we have to keep the pressure on, because humans' memories are short, unfortunately, not like that elephant behind you, Ian. We have very short memories. And once we get out of a tight situation, a few months or a few years later, we've forgotten all about it. We thought it never happened. So we do need to use this moment to institutionalize change, to our laws, our funding and our programs so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again with this devastating pandemic. We don't find ourselves losing those million species over coming decades, and we don't get up to 3 degrees increase over coming decades. So, you know, and you just talked about what can each individual do. Ian referred to it. I always talk about, you know, as a consumer, as an investor, because we may be investors, even small-time investors, or you might have pension funds. And as citizens, we're all citizens. And for us as an initiative, we reach out to everyone to say, contact your own politicians, push for change, push for changes to international laws, because the more they hear it from different places and different people, the more likely you are to succeed. So never underestimate your own ability to be a part of fundamental changes.
Ian, would you like to make any final remarks?
I was just wondering whether to build on what John was saying, because politicians, obviously, they want to be re-elected. So they're reluctant to take unpopular decisions. So you have to convince them, and as many of your friends and relatives, that the decisions we're asking them to take are popular. You give them a mandate. So every time there's a petition, sign it if it's pushing for politicians, because then they'll say, look, X million people have signed this petition. I have a mandate to do this, even though some industries, some shareholders, some companies might feel that this is a wrong decision for their short-term goals. It's rather unfortunate that every company has a legal obligation to maximize profit for its shareholders. And rather than think of the longer term potential for maximum human well-being, sorry, there's various directions that could go in terms of redefining our relationship with nature. But keeping it simple, yes, appreciate nature and animals and plants for their beauty, but remember that they have a function as well. And that when we want to save them, we don't just want to save a small representative sample like a stamp collection. Oh, we've still got a few of those, so they're not extinct. But if they once covered an area and now they cover 2% of that area, that means you're getting 2% of the function. And if you think of the biosphere as our life support system, if you had an elderly relative on a life support machine and you said, well, let's turn it down to 15%, that'll be all right. I don't think you'd be in agreement with that. You say, no, my elderly relatives need a life support system working at full whack, or at least at 3/4. And yet, if we base our conservation on protected areas alone, as Ali's pointed out, it's about 15, maybe 17%. That's not enough. There's a movement called nature needs half. Most people are going to say, well, we can't completely divorce ourselves from half of the surface of the land, but we have to live in a way that is compatible with ecosystem function. And that may mean modifying our farming techniques. It may mean certainly modifying our shopping techniques, reducing our consumption so that each one of us uses less. Look at our carbon footprint and our forest footprint. What impact do we from our home, wherever we are in the world, have on forests on the other side of the planet? It's kind of the reverse of chaos theory, which says that if a butterfly flaps its wing on one side of the world, there might be a hurricane on the other because of the intervening events. Here, you buy a packet of biscuits on this side of the world, and effectively you're paying someone to cut down a tree in Indonesia to grow more oil palm. So we all have that ability to influence things around the world, and we can only exercise that ability when we're informed. So help to inform your friends, certainly inform your political, your elected representatives. And I think we're going to do it. As John says, that these three crises coming together, each one exacerbating the other. And so it's not just the rantings of a few greenies as it was perhaps in the 70s and 80s. It's now serious political thinkers and heads of international organizations saying we need to change. And change is not necessarily easy or comfortable, but the alternative of not changing is going to be much more difficult and much more uncomfortable, to the point of disaster. So I don't want to end, this is Earth Day, we're celebrating the Earth. The good news is that nature regenerates itself. So very often it's not telling people to do something, it's telling them to stop doing things. Just let nature be and it will flourish. And we might give it a hand here and there, and certainly Born Free is very good at that. You rescue an animal from a horrible life, you put it into its natural habitat, and what does it do? It eats and it poos. So it's contributing to that ecosystem. So we want animals back in the wild, not just because it feels wonderful to give an animal its freedom, but also because it's got a job to do. It's the gardener of the forest or the savannah or the coastal plains, and we all benefit from animals doing those jobs. And that's what we haven't previously valued.
Yes. Well, this is a very good reminder, and certainly quite timely with it being Earth Day. And I'm sure that we could all talk for another hour, but we've come to the end of our time. I would like to thank everyone here, John, Ian, and Elise, as well as to the folks who sent in the videos that you heard, Ralph Shami, Ali Mahama, James Opong, Attorney Dolo, and Jenny Desmond for those great messages. And thank you to all of you for attending. And please help us continue this work and make an investment in nature by also investing in Born Free. You can make a gift at bornfreeusa.org or by texting Born Free to 44321. And I know there were a lot of really wonderful questions I saw coming through the chat. We will follow up with you by email, and there will be an email going out tomorrow to all who registered. And it'll include the websites for rebalance.earth and endwildlifecrime.org, so you can learn more about those initiatives as well as the Global Nature Recovery Investment Initiative. So thank you very much for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon and evening. Bye.